We now want to dig into, as Spiro said, some of the themes that have been coming up, particularly around all this technology and society. I think for us at INSEAD, we sort of, as we think about the school, there are these two big trends in the business world that we try and react to. One is sort of the world that Kathryn comes from, all of this new technology, how it's changing business and the excitement. But then there's this other big mega trend out there, which is despite all the material wealth and stuff that's been generated by the economy, this incredible tension that seems to be building up between business and society. And so we're going to ask Kathryn to have a dialogue with Professor Subi Rangan, who really has been the colleague several years ago who saw that trend coming around business and society and has pulled together a whole society, multiple Nobel Prize winners, coming together to try and think how can we sort of save capitalism by reconciling performance and progress of society. Clearly, technology is creating additional tensions in that area. Please welcome back Kathryn and Subi Rangan.
As you wish. Assume, I think, the bigger one, please. Good morning, everybody. I just came back from San Francisco, and I was at a visit with LinkedIn. And one of the founders of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, he is now also at Greylock Partners. And they were just celebrating, I think, a few years ago, their 50th anniversary. How many of you here have heard of Greylock Partners? A few of you have. Okay, so I don't know Greylock that well. Apparently, it's a good firm. But what surprised me was Greylock was founded by, it was a kind of spin-off from a company called ARDC. How many of you have heard of ARDC? There's at least one person. Peter, you heard of ARDC? American Research and Development Corporation. And this was supposedly one of the first, if not the first, venture capital firm in the US. And the founder of ARDC is a guy named George Dorio, who was the founder of INSEAD. And so there I was at LinkedIn feeling like, this is the grandchild. INSEAD is somehow related there. But we're going to have this discussion continuing on society. And I want to share just some perspective. Like Peter, I'm a strategy professor at INSEAD. We look at, Kathryn, when I look at technology, I see so far 4 things that technology has given us. Productivity. So if you think about technology, how old do you think is the first technology that we would call technology? What do you think? How old?
The plow.
The plow. Anybody? Millions of years. 2 to 3 million years. Our predecessors are making tools. The first flints, the first axes, the first bow, arrow, these kind of implements have been around for millions. Fire, also for hundreds of thousands of years. This is before Homo sapien. So technology, if you take technology as tools and methods, technology has been with us for a long time. And I think, as Spiros was trying to show, if you make a kind of correlation between technology and well-being over time, generally, I haven't done the analysis, but my casual reflection is the correlation is pretty strongly positive. And if you do that same analysis with geographies where technology has really been developed and adopted, and again, well-being in those geographies, again, the relationship seems to be positive. So we're going to talk about AI in society and technology in society more broadly, but if we take a very long historical perspective, it seems to be a net benefit. Whether this particular technology and whether this generation, how that goes, that's a different question. And so coming back to technology, Kathryn, I see 4 things from technology so far and maybe a 5th one. Productivity. protection, pleasure, as in instruments or games or so on, and of course, more and more power. So almost every country that has technology, that is a leader in technology, whether that's Israel or France or the US or China or Russia, they all have a strong defense industry. Countries that lead in, especially in these kinds of technologies, defense and military power and strategic power seem to go together. So these are the 4 P's that the 4, productivity, protection, pleasure, and power. And now, of course, Spiros points out there's the 5th P, which is personhood. Singularity, and technology seems to be able to do everything. And it's very, very unclear. They're writing poetry, and maybe they can't do the causal analysis as yet, but we know even emotionally, technology is really catching up. And what I wanted to do with you was maybe talk about 3 issues. One was about AI, but even more broadly, technology in society. We see that there are some concerns, and I'd like to probe that. A second thing is, in terms of the skill set, not everybody here is a student, but there are many young people here, and many of them will be making their careers, like you will be, in that coming decades. And what is the kind of skill set that you see? And the third thing is about, being shaped by, I think all of us will be shaped by this, and so we have to be somewhat resilient. But if some people here wanted to shape the evolution of AI and technology in general, is that even possible, or is it only Elon Musk and a few other people who will be able to do that? So these are the 3 topics I wanted to discuss with you. And in terms of timing, I think we have just about 25 minutes or so. There is a timer there, and if we can cover these issues, is that okay for you? Can we go on that way?
Yeah.
So in terms of society, there are so many ways, and we talked about this, but one set of issues was relating to power, market power, concentration. Is it a winner-take-all? Is it a winner-take-most? And will we then have to break up these very big companies and so on? Another issue is, of course, the pocketbook. Pocketbook, maybe not in terms of employment, although that seems to be looming. So the jobs issue and AI really is an important issue, but also in terms of the inequality in incomes. I told you I just came back from San Francisco. You know what's happening in the real estate market there. It just seems like there is a growing disparity. And we know technology is not neutral in terms of labor. Certain skills get kind of enhanced. And the third issue is about privacy, whether it's cybersecurity, what has happened with Facebook and Google, and so on and so forth. These are at least 3 big issues. What do you think of these 3 issues? You can start in any of those 3.
Well, these are big issues. I'm going to dive a little bit into privacy because I find that it sits at an interesting nexus between all of the other Ps. So power, productivity, personhood, and really can well illustrate and elucidate some of the big questions that we're facing as it relates to human rights and society as we adopt these new technologies. So if we step back as it relates to power, if you look online right now, you can find documentation on various countries' strategies as it relates to the adoption of artificial intelligence. So I'm living in Canada right now. Canada has a strategy. The skill sets and the historic strengths of Canada are in the research, the world of research, and not as much in the world of commercialization. The economy is built upon oil and gas and milk. There's a lot of cows, and right now there's trade negotiations going on with NAFTA where those that will suffer most from a lot of the, what Trump's doing in Canada right now are farmers. China's got its strategy. France has its strategy. United States is getting there, trying to make its strategy on AI. So and then if we think about sort of where the power of these technologies come from, part of it is going to be the algorithms and the smarts that goes into the computational power, but a lot of it will come from the data, as I discussed in my first presentation, where when we move from a world of intelligent design where we humans hand code the rules to design our systems to the realm of sort of this bottom-up data-oriented systems, the more data you have, the better. And privacy then, and privacy paradigms and the cultural differences and what qualify as privacy then become front and center in this big power story. So in China right now, there's privacy is sort of not really a thing. It hasn't ever been a thing. And so companies like Tencent, companies like Alibaba, Tencent for me is a remarkable company. If you think about it, it basically is a holding company for the entire economy. There's the retail side, the entertainment side. Imagine every vertical in an economy combined together into one company, and therefore individual data on my preferences and my behavior across just about every domain of my existence is within the data set and the realm and the parameters of understanding of a company like Tencent. A company like that cannot exist within the United States because our privacy laws are devised per consumer vertical. So PCI, personal credit card information, is protected and must be governed in a certain way. Personal health information is protected and must be governed in a certain way. The media industry in the United States doesn't have a ton of privacy regulations, which was why companies like Google and Facebook are able to grow at the massively expansive rate that they have over the past 15 years, because they're not subject to the same limitations on use of data that the financial services companies are. In Europe, from what I understand, and I'm a generalist, so I dabble across these various philosophical issues. So permit, if Subik, you can correct me if I say something incorrect. But my understanding is that privacy, while in the U.S. it's a consumer right, while in China it basically doesn't exist. In Europe, it's more considered as a part of human rights, and therefore your religious preferences, your sexual preferences, fall into the gambit of things that should be protected by privacy laws as represented in the new general data protection regulations that came out and go into effect this year. So within that landscape, we then say there's some big questions that are arising. The one is, you note how a company's ability to collect data, what it can collect, and how that influences both economic opportunity and civic power shifts across these various contextual social worlds. And number two, and this is where I think this gets really interesting, I think well, actually, let me step back. Privacy is also directly correlated with freedom of expression, the freedom for us for Subi and I to say, we don't like what the government's doing, and we are going to have a conversation with one another behind closed doors, and the government can't listen. Right? So freedom of expression, freedom of thought, these core human rights are tightly integrated with our ability to do stuff without being observed. And this gets very interesting when these boundaries between our existence as civilians and our existence as consumers start to blur, and we try to think about how to govern effective use of data for commercial purposes. And the foundations of privacy law have always sought with the rights of the data subject. So tying back into freedom. So Kathryn, if you look at how constructions around minimum use have been constructed so far, I go in and I say Subi works at Google, I say, Google, you may use my data for this purpose, you may not use it for this purpose. So I've given you, the task at hand is for you to provide me information on my search. If I have informed consent, right? If I know enough about what's going on there, I can say, okay, you may use it for this. But guess what? You can't then reuse it for other use cases. So Facebook, you may use my data. I'm going to put up my picture of me hanging out with my friends, drinking. You may use this to enable personalization of my feed so that I can see what my friends see and have information that's fun for me. You may not reuse this to have brands come in and sell me stuff that I'm not interested in. Although that's sort of what happens. So that friction there, where all of our laws and conceptions have started with, I as a data subject, say you may use it for these purposes, require a notion of consent where we kind of know what we're doing. And when we move into the AI world, I think the technology is putting a lot of pressure and challenging these traditional notions of privacy because, number one, who in the room feels like they can provide informed consent to Facebook on how this company is using your data? Number one, there's going to be all sorts of uses that you just don't know about. Number two, it's so hard for us, going back to that Maslow's hierarchy of data science, to truly rationally appreciate what happens when we become a point in that bell curve. So we can't even imagine what's going on with these tools, let alone consent to them, and think clearly about the trade-offs between what the services we might receive versus not receive if we were to sort of restrict use of that data. Number two, if Subi and I differ in terms of our preferences on what data may be used and what's not, I might say I only want it for this cases, he might say use it everywhere. Downstream, that could lead to bias and fairness issues, because bias occurs in algorithms when one population is less well represented than another population. And therefore, a lot of the instincts that communities might have in protecting their rights by reserving their data become challenged because they might end up getting unequal services if they're less well represented in the future. So these notions of bias and privacy are correlated with one another in complex ways. Number three, and this is one that really challenges you. It actually may be the case that in this brave new world of machine learning, more data means more privacy. Here's why. So I live in a building at 110 Charles Street in Toronto. And postal codes in Toronto are affiliated with, they're very small jurisdictions. So it's basically my building. So say a company is able to work with information at the aggregate, but not at the individual. So the company has said, I'm allowed to personalize some prediction for you, sort of at if you're one of 500,000, you're one of 5,000, you're one of 500, but I'm not going to know Kathryn. This is indeed Kathryn with her footprint, her neuroses, her blood type, et cetera. So here's where this gets tricky. So if we have one data set, and it's a company, and they have information about the postal code, that means I'm one of 500, because it's my building, let's say there's 500 people in it. If they get a second data set that has information about gender, we can assume there's half and half, right? That there's 50% women, 50% men in my building. I then become one of 250, excuse me, so half and half. If they then get a data set that has my age, so we can assume I live in sort of a upper middle class. A lot of people in building are people like me. We're relatively middle-aged professionals, so it's not like a bunch of students. You gotta have a little bit of money to be there. Not super rich, but also not super poor. So we can say, all right, there's gonna be a decent amount of 34-year-old women in this building. So it goes from I'm one of 250 to maybe I'm one of 75. If the company had a data set that had my birth date, not my year, not my age, but April 11th, 1984, it's either me or maybe one other person. So you note how what seems like we're working at an aggregate, one of 500, very quickly, with a clever combination of data sets, gets down to 2 or 1. So when we reframe privacy that way, going sort of outside in as opposed to from the rights of the data subject, the more data, the better, right? I want to be obfuscated. I want to be a needle in the haystack. I don't want to be Kathryn. And there are actually technical protocol, there's a name called Differential Privacy, that are emerging that actually make it so that we can solve this whole you can't get to 1 from 500. So I think we need to shift the game. I think we need to be rethinking privacy from the perspective of these statistical averages, and we need to focus on the technology, and we need to be investing research, and there is a lot of research around the world right now into these new capabilities, but we need to be investing research into solving that problem, not the one around data rights. But it challenges the foundations of subjecthood. It challenges the foundations of how we think about consent, and the regulatory paradigms they're not there. GDPR rests upon the legal fiction that we as individuals actually can have a voice against Google. And we need to be careful.
So I want to pick up on that. I mean, who's shaping this, if anybody? And for example, for standards like credit card standards or MP3 or something like this, JPEG, there is a group called the ISO, the International Standards Organization, in which working groups of industry and other representatives, maybe some regulatory representatives, get together and kind of co-develop wide standards, maybe even universal standards. A credit card works anywhere in the world thanks to ISO. Is there such an ISO for AI or for data rights? And do you think data rights are more like property rights, or are they like human rights? They're the intersection of these two?
So yeah, so two questions there. So who's shaping it? I think there's, one of the positive things is that there's activity afoot in different countries thinking about this problem. So, and the problem here being basically responsible artificial intelligence that has subcategories around how should security, what are the security issues, what are the privacy issues, and then two new categories. What are the fairness issues, and then what are the transparency and explainability issues? In Canada, I can speak from personal experience. I'm an American living in Canada right now, and what's been very remarkable to me is that as a plain old entrepreneur trying to build out a company, I am in dialogue with the Privacy Commissioner and the Minister of Economic Innovation, helping them ensure that the changes that they make as it relates to policy and standards are in keeping with where the technology stands. So they are soliciting information from people that are in the ground, on the ground building these tools to try to sort of keep up, to try to make sure that the conceptual framework they're using is aligned with what's really,
Is this at this point rather national?
I've seen it as national. I mean, there is, so as it relates to ISO, I think I've seen it where it starts off in sort of national pockets. There are some international groups, but I find that at that level, things need to be brought up to a level of generality where it becomes very, very big picture, and a lot of the existing conceptual carapaces that we've inherited from how we've thought about these problems historically are there. So now, I guess it's like, yeah.
Again, just because of time, I know we talked about privacy. There's the whole issue of jobs in the pocketbook, the inequality in wages and so on. And then there is the issue of market power and concentration. But among this and other issues, we haven't talked about cybersecurity, although that is also related to the privacy issues and so on. Is there one that you are really concerned? You may or may not be working on it, but what concerns you as someone from the inside who's seeing some of these things bottom up, but also across different players, university, industry, and
this isn't quite privacy, but I think what happened with the use of Facebook in the American elections is a very worthy lesson as it relates to the potential negative social implications of AI. So Nick Bostrom, who's a professor at Oxford, wrote a book called Superintelligence that has done a lot of work guiding how, for example, Elon Musk and Bill Gates are thinking about the existential threats around technology. And Bostrom's book starts off with what's now become a very famous fiction around a paperclip maximizer. So the Paperclip Maximizer is built, and it's an AI whose job is to make as many paperclips as fast as possible and productively and efficiently as possible. And it's a valueless system, so it realizes that the best way to make paperclips is to get these pesky humans out of the equation. So it goes off and basically annihilates the human race so that it could just mine its ore on its own without any of the distractions of us with our microbiomes and our emotions and our junk. And so you listen to that and you say, well, evil overlords. But it's like a fable de La Fontaine, right? It's meant to be one particular, and you learn the lesson, and then you apply the lesson elsewhere. So if we think about the American elections, they're kind of like a paperclip maximizer. So Facebook, and this back to my talk, where I said AI succeeds in domains where the goals are well defined and the means aren't. So Facebook is tuned to optimize for engagement from the users, and we engage with, we have our projections of ourselves where we want to be great civilians learning a lot and challenging our intellects, and then we have our little mammalian reptilian brains who want to look at Kim Kardashian photos. And therefore, if Kim Kardashian photos keep us clicking, that's what we're going to see. And if seeing incendiary news about a political issue is what keeps us clicking, that's what we're going to see. And if people who understand how these systems work can then game that system to try to influence the outcome of an election, that's what's going to happen. So our being mindful of the fact that these systems aren't as smart as we think they are and depend upon a construct that we humans make related to what goal we are optimizing for. And when that gets inadvertently used in a situation for which the technology was not originally imagined and designed, as Spiros talked about, that's something for us to pay attention to.
Okay, let's switch to robust, resilient. skill set. It's not because we've completed this. You can see how vast and scary sometimes. If you read the Nick Bostrom book, then that is very, very scary. What is the kind of skill set that you would say younger people who want to be entrepreneurs, who just want to have a meaningful but somewhat stable or not totally anxiety-provoked career, what would you say are the skill sets? What should this group, and there's a business bias here, it's not a bunch of scientists as far as I know, they might have been, what would you say? Okay, so it's interesting, you just said anxiety-provoking career. I'll do one from my first-person experience, and then I'll go through some of the other stuff. I'm reading right now Harari's new book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and there was one sentence that caught my mind, which was that when you have to reinvent yourself again and again and again, it's actually kind of anxiety-inducing. Yeah. I've done it. I was a literature PhD who now runs an AI company, and I'm going to do it again because the economy that we live in is one where the old apprenticeship world that was developed at the law firms and the banks and the accounting firms of yore, it doesn't hold that well anymore. So a career that's built upon your learning your trade and then learning your trade in practice with somebody who's done that trade for 1 million years and then going up that path, that's not really how things work anymore. Therefore, getting comfortable with anxiety, because it's there. You shift domains, your whole identity is built upon something that you've learned in INSEAD, and now you got to go redo it again and again and again. Getting comfortable with that, I think, is an emotional resilience that is required for the 21st century. In particular with AI, where these systems, this might change as research efforts are pushing in this direction, but right now they're idiot savants, they're not Renaissance men. So they are great, and I have a friend who critiqued me for saying idiot savant is not a politically correct term, so I apologize for using it, but they're great at doing one narrow task, and it might be even super intelligent. So you have the world's best cancer diagnostic radiology tool. And you think about it, you gotta go to med school for years in order to learn how to diagnose a lung with cancer, and a machine can learn that in hours because it has so many computer cycles. And that seems super intelligent, but it's that machine can only do that. You show it a picture of, say it's a lung diagnostic tool, if you show it a picture of brains, it cannot do it. Therefore, our ability to generalize and transfer skills across tasks, super important in a world where the tasks that are automated are narrow. So going down a career path where you're going to be sort of a domain expertise who's the world's best accountant, probably not a smart move. Going down a career path where you can do accounting, but you can also do this and you can also do that, you got more safety. And then the third thing I want to mention is we don't all need to code in Python. We don't all need to be deploying neural networks. We don't all need to know exactly which architecture is the right one for image data and which one's the right for text data and which is right for time series data. Engineers will do that, but you do need to have a decent conceptual appreciation of statistics, because that's what this stuff is. And there's courses to do that. And you have to insist. I mean, if I were to go get a job today, I would talk to my HR head or my manager, and I'd be like, I want this. This is my human right as somebody working in the AI economy to sort of be able to understand this. And as I said in the presentation, as I've seen, the best way to learn this stuff is to get involved in a POC, is to get involved in one of the projects that the company is inevitably working on. Just put your hand up and fight to get there, and they'll say no, and you fight more, because it's really the staging ground to learn this stuff. I'll just make one comment on this. Many years ago, back in the 1930s, 2 economists wrote a paper. And the puzzle was, why do developed countries end up with having all this employment in the service sector? And the way they addressed it was, they said, well, humanity started with the primary sector, agriculture and mining, and eventually productivity improved there, and we were able to release labor, and it went into the secondary sector, which was manufacturing and transformation. Eventually, productivity improved in the manufacturing sector with the machines and all of the lean movement and so on. and labor was again released, and this labor found the service sector, the tertiary sector. Now, the tertiary sector became the graveyard of human capital. Productivity never improved in the service sector until now. For the first time, whether it is retail, whether it is driving, whether it is healthcare, eventually education, productivity in the service sector is being, Annette asked about being disrupted. The service sector productivity is being severely disrupted. Anything repetitive, anything that is algorithmic will be taken care of and done cheaper, better, faster, more reliably by machines. And so in that time, these two guys said there will be a quaternary sector. The quaternary sector is the creative design sector, where you learn to connect the dots. Many of you will be working in the quaternary sector. Perhaps all of us will be there because our education allows us to do that, and our social networks allow us to do that. If I were to make just a couple of very, simplistic and focused points. One, I have a son who is now working, and he's working with big data and all of this. And the one thing I realize is people are so focused on the data, they don't understand the value in the verticals. So she said, yes, don't get obsessed with the verticals, but that doesn't mean you just play with the data. If you don't understand banking or healthcare or education or transport or government or security, whatever the vertical, if you don't understand the value, so the first thing I would say is please don't lose your value mentality. It is ultimately about productivity or about protection or something. Focus on that. The second thing is if you don't understand how to work with people and how to scale up things, if you don't understand human resources and you think it's all about technology and it's all about the customer, you will not be a successful entrepreneur. You can start up, but you will not be able to scale up without the people skills, without the networks. The third thing is, of course, you've got to know something about the technology, and therefore going to conferences like this where you see the possibilities, and whether it is robotics or whether it is the chip that is the size of a grain of salt, and the software and all of the paraphernalia, but especially the neuroscience, the behavior. It's not just about technology, it's technology in a setting that is rather fundamentally biological, social, and natural. And two other things. One is partnerships. So many of the things are going to be done with partnerships. So there is some theories of why some partnerships are more successful. And the final thing is the law and regulation. Laws and regulation are coming up. You cannot be a successful technologist who's scaling up if you are completely blind about what's the privacy rights, what's the other data regulations or other regulations, labor regulations. Any last thoughts? We have just over 5 minutes, and I wanted to ask you, and by the way, one big thing that I'm taking away from your comments is, in a human capital, there are two things. There's cognitive and there's the non-cognitive. And the resilient part is especially the cognitive stuff, the non-cognitive stuff. Embrace anxiety, be playful. It's okay to fail repeatedly and still think that you are worth something. And AI will kill us on the cognitive stuff. Whether AI can kill us on the non-cognitive, which is where character, judgment resides, that's a whole different story. So please just bear that in mind. The last question I had was about people wanting to shape the thing. Is it already predetermined and we're all kind of excluded? We just watch and listen to people like you? Or if somebody wanted to become an insider, I mean, I think of Israel and France and China and maybe Silicon Valley and a few other places, Toronto, as being centers of where this AI is being shaped. What do you think? Can people do that?
I think it's a great question. I was thinking through this. There's people like a lot of the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley have megaphones that are shaping how we think about AI. So I think about Elon Musk as an example of somebody who, with the multiple millions of Twitter followers, has put an image in our mind around what these capabilities are that's largely determined by science fiction, and we have the images of robots and stuff, and for good cause. It's super hard for us to imagine mathematical equations, which is all that this stuff is. So we need to embody them some way. So there's to a certain extent, will you be shaping the discourse of AI? Will you be shaping how people think about this? You might, if you're interested in going down that path, do kind of the work that I've been doing and trying to build out, my identity as somebody who's educating people out there. But then in your data, but maybe you won't do that. So then it comes, all right, so how do you shape the technology? So there's not just one AI. And particularly now that it's built upon data, and every company is going to have its unique data set. And if you're working within a company, it's a staging ground to build an AI product. And I really like what Subi said, where it's not just, there are ready-made tools that are off the shelf that you buy and you'd plug into your system, and those will largely be shaped by the Googles that are creating them. So computer vision capabilities, the ability to recognize this is a cat, this is a dog. By this point, you're probably not going to shape that. The only place you could shape it would be to exert your human rights when the system is not well representing Black women, and you would get together with your community and say, we want to be represented in this data set. So there's a political shaping that could impact large consumer companies, as long as you've got a group that's large enough to make a dent in the system. And then there's like more prosaic shaping, which is, I'm giving a talk in a couple of weeks, and I'm starting off, and I'm just going to say this is the most mundane story in the history of artificial intelligence, but it's a true story, and it's everyone's story. And this is a story about a Big Four accounting firm building a tool to help them automate compliance with a acceptable accounting principles checklist. It's like really not sexy stuff, but it's a story where people engage with the system. They had a way of working. They felt certainty and comfort in how they worked. And then the system comes and it outputs a probability of 0.6, and they're like, what am I supposed to do with this? I can't provide certainty in saying that a checklist has been audited with a 0.6% confidence rate. This is absurd, which means you got to get a human in the loop. And it goes back to, as Eve was saying, with the human versus the machine. And we have to think creatively about how we reconcile the fact that these probabilities don't make sense to us, and we have to, overcome our own fears of being displaced as we work for the good of the business. And so I think it's all of our heroic journey, honestly, but in ways that they might not be influencing history with a big H, but they can influence, your own life and your ability to maintain viable with a little h. And everybody's in that game these days. So I think there's a way of viewing it where, we can all make a dent.
One thing I've seen just listening to you this morning is, and I think this applies to all of us, if we do want to shape this thing, we will have to be educated. And you get educated by going to conferences like this, but you pick an area, whether it is privacy or whether it is data, whether it's analytics, whether it is neuroscience and the intersection of that, or whether it is some other aspect of this. But really, without a foundation, it's going to be very hard. The second thing after the education is the engagement. It requires energy. If you care about this stuff, if you want to shape this, not just be shaped by it, because all of us will be shaped by it, you definitely will require energy to engage. And with what intention? This is the third point. And here I come back to the opening that Peter made. My feeling is that technology without trust will lead to a very, very turbulent adoption and development of this. It needn't be that way. We can have technology and trust. I think, of course, we have to be playful. The Googles and the Facebooks and the Ubers are teaching us so many lessons. When any new thing emerges, there's a lot of turbulence. So that is definitely not a new thing. But I think if you keep in mind that this technology should not just be about performance, it should also somehow be about progress. Progress not only for this generation, but for future generations. That we are, of course, we take risk, but what we want to minimize is regret. And if we can keep that in mind, I think we can, in some way, meaningfully engage both in the micro and the macro. Our time is up. Kathryn, a double pleasure. Thank you all. Peter, back to you.
It's great.